So I entitled the paper Rights in Context, Exploring Faith-Based Humanitarianism Through the Lens of Refugee Hosting. Its simpler title might be taken from one of my interviewees in Turkey in a humanitarian organisation who said to me simply, "The future is political." Much of our work on refugee hosts has been concerned with themes and practices of protection and assistance, addressing questions of rights and rightlessness within the plural and complex context of refugee host, civil society, and national and international humanitarian response. In consciously moving away from state-centric and narrowly international humanitarian narratives and choosing to focus on communities of displacement and hosting, we have not, however, sought to lose the state as an actor. Rather, we have sought to understand the complex, mutual implication of state and non-state actors, refugees and hosts, in the construction of refugee realities. To express this more philosophically, we have not sought to conduct a programme of research that seeks to collapse or dissolve consideration of the properly political questions of rights into the softer space of the ethical. Never mind rights, let's just talk about hospitality. For better or for worse, we have sought to reread the mutual implication of the political and the ethical as it arises in the lives of a complex range of agents who shape the localised, and in this sense also nationalised, globalised experience of refugees. This might be articulated as an attempt at sustained, multifaceted attention to the question of rights in their socio-cultural, socio-legal, and socio-religious context. I do not think it is unfair to say that such readings still remain fairly underdeveloped in much rights-based discourse, humanitarian and academic. Hannah Arendt's work figures the aporia, in other words, the pathlessness of the refugee, as evidence of both the negation of rights and their endless fragile reinstantiation, holding in critical relation the political in the ethical and the ethical in the political. In critically extending Arendt's work, and anybody who's Turkish, I can only apologise for my pronunciation, Ayten Gündoğdu argues, rightly I think, that rather than despairing in the face of the impossibility of rights work, we might, quote, take them, that is the perplexity of rights, as challenging political and ethical dilemmas that can be navigated differently, including in ways that bring to view new understandings of the relationship between rights, citizenship and humanity, end of quote. In this sense, to study rights is, inevitably and necessarily, to be interpreters of, quote, struggles to reinvent the meaning of rights. Arendt's work remained critical diagnostic in mode. She does not propose to us a new theory of normative rights, but rather she calls for critical attention to the aporia, the pathlessness of rightlessness, and its negotiation by agents in history. It is to the historical performance of the aporia, the pathlessness, that she demands critical attention. As Gündoğdu notes, quote, an Arendtian politics of human rights centres on the political agency of those subjects whose rights are at stake and who venture to vindicate these rights and declare new ones. Our work has, I think, in multiple genres, followed that critical diagnostic spirit. In this final sense, it adds, Bouchani and Lyndsey talked yesterday about his incredible No Friend But the Mountains. So it adds Bouchani's insights to Arendt's, that we can only know the condition of rights and rightlessness through a multi-perspectival analysis. In Arendt's work, refugees figure rupture as well as mere displacement. Nonetheless, we, political cultures, so who do I mean by we? Political cultures, including scholars of rights, find ourselves drawn less to the figuring and the significance of the rupture, which is carried into refugee experience, than to the question of matter perceived to be out of territorial place. I'm interested in that question of rupture insofar as refugees figure a rupturing, or they are the evidence of rupture of the original social contract, and they carry that rupture into contexts where a social contract rightly then has to be and should be ethically renegotiated by those who then come to belong to the territory. Wergundodu talks of the need to look at, quote, the political struggles that introduce new understanding of rights. My contribution to the Refugee Hosts research project has been to listen to and critically reflect on the ways that local humanitarian actors, especially but not exclusively faith-based actors, have conceived of their role in fostering practices and an understanding of membership, the politics of membership, in response to rightlessness. In what follows, I wish to note that one of the striking things about conducting empirical research into local humanitarian responses is that listening to the interpretation and the experience of local actors takes the researcher back into figuring exactly this reality of rupture as part of and not separate from the ongoing apparatic structure of refugee rights and rightlessness. In 10 minutes now, I want to draw out 4 brief reflections on common themes from around 40 interviews with local and national humanitarian actors working in local communities in Turkey, Lebanon and Jordan, and also some based in Geneva and London. These themes relate to the ways that these organisations reflected on the politics of membership as it relates to their work. The framing, the shared assumptions made by all interviewees was that a culture of rights was fragile, threatened, and in formal terms, narrowing or shrinking in all 3 contexts, albeit in different ways. A shared assumption was also that rights cultures are regenerated in multiple ways and require local place-based cultures to ground the refounding of rights. In different ways, the interviews also highlighted ways in which local actors seek to recognise a culture of rights beyond mere refugee supplication. I want to say just 2 things briefly about a note on the limitations of this analysis before somebody rightly points it out in questions. First of all, this is reflection and very early analysis of the interviews we've done with local and national humanitarian actors that have a presence in the local communities that we've been working in. It doesn't figure the perceptions of such actors by refugees and hosts themselves and ways that refugees engage these agents in agency with these local actors. Elena's work has talked about that in more detail. Kat, if she's here, I know her work does that as well. Nor does it deal in ways that relate to the previous presentation about the structural role of religious actors in the denial of rights. So none of this is meant to romanticise that. Rather, I've been working with civil and faith actors who are located in these local contexts, and I'm trying to read and honour what they have said in the interviews. So I'm claiming no more than an attempt to deal with what they said to me and figure that in a dialogue with some social theory. So, my first of 2 themes that structure the 4 points. Beyond an innocent account of localisation, power and co-option. Local actors expressed their ambivalence about the localisation of aid agenda, as well as the shift from humanitarian to development agendas. Repeatedly, interviewees expressed the view that they felt caught in a complex relationship with both state actors and international humanitarian actors. On the one hand, interviewees were clear that they experienced the turn towards localisation as simultaneously sometimes enabling of their contributions. There is a greater recognition of the role of the local, including faith-based agents in building effective and durable relationships with both refugee host communities, including relationships that facilitate recognition of and access to rights. But local actors also express concern about a lack of recognition of the role of power in the conception of and operation of the localisation agenda. Questions of religious specificity often boiled down, as I was mentioning in the previous session, to rather less exceptional concerns about unacknowledged operation of power, decision-making and co-option. So they were more about the operation of power, decision-making and co-option. Responses suggest that there is a circulating problem of power inequalities in local contexts of displacement, and the localisation agenda can feed into those and intensify them. refugees, hosts, and local organisations experience this in different and overlapping ways. 2. Vis-à-vis state actors, local actors talked of the Janus phase of the localisation agenda, woven through with a shift towards political narratives of integration, social cohesion, and harmonisation. These are seen as non-innocent narratives that bear complex relationships to the perception of local actors, that their own strengths lie in place-based and partnership models of working, that figure relationships over time in localities rather than simply the colonisation of spaces. In one sense, many local actors already figure host-refugee relationality, but they are increasingly aware that their own version of motivations and practices that build such relations exist in a tensive relationship to state agendas and risk co-option into state narratives of rights, hospitality, belonging, unbelonging, and increasingly expulsion. 3. Local actors, especially but not only in Turkey, repeatedly express their belief that they are operating in a state-instigated shrinking humanitarian space. As such, they are negotiating the simultaneously constructed localisation and politicisation and securitisation of their work. These interviews mirrored, therefore, what might be judged to be global trends towards the increasing surveillance and control of local responses to refugees. Local actors were aware that this shrinking humanitarian space has critical importance, not only for questions of assistance, but also for how rights cultures are kept alive. The practices of trust, equality, and relationship building that many local and faith-based actors talk about as hallmarks of their work are at stake in this. Local actors noted that a shrinking humanitarian space not only denies direct refugee protection rights, but also host legal rights to offer hospitality and to cultivate rights. A shrinking humanitarian space tears at the very conditions upon which rights depend. In this context, local actors talk of their attempts to keep open the tight space of protection possibilities. Point 4, which is my final point, founding practices of political belonging. While state agendas drive at the question of territorial membership, when I asked a set of questions about the vision and value of organisations, a common pattern emerging across responses was an attempt to articulate the role of local faith actors in facilitating both ways that refugees and hosts might figure and configure the consequences of rupture in the experience of host and refugee host experience. Organisations talked of the way in which their work attempts to facilitate ways that refugees and hosts come to appear to each other. The way in which organisations described this was so resonant with Arendt's understanding of how we come to appear to each other and how a public is created. As public and personal beings, as truly and fully human, talking of ways to co-construct a fragile form of political community, how that might be built, albeit without the power of institutional guarantees. Organisations spoke frequently of the conscious attempt to generate political community, with a focus on creating spaces for participation and gift exchange, and in some instances, common spaces to act together. Overcoming animosity and suspicion inter and intra-community through common projects rather than a focus on individual and segregated needs was notable, again cutting against the sort of religion and vulnerability agenda. This cuts against the tendency to focus on identity markers and a politics of intra-refugee separation as part of a humanitarian-driven vulnerability narrative. Local actors talked of the value of local actors in generating trust, stability, and relationship, and the idea of a durable life, a life that can be imagined in time and not just space. So, my conclusion. These interviews raise again the question of how rights claims are kept alive at a communal cultural level, especially when they appear most fragile and unrealised. Many local actors feel that they exist in a tight space of what others have called a protection impasse, and feel the ambivalence of this and within their own action in this space. Faith-based actors are aware of the conflicted space and place of religion, as inclusion and exclusion as material resource that can be put to use for and against rights regimes, as we were hearing. They are also clear, mirroring the sentiments of Simone Weil, writing on the history of force, that hospitable practices are not in themselves justice, but rather stand as proxies for justice, absent but constantly represented. I would venture, based on these interviews and the growing literature on local, including faith-based responses, that the register of how we study rights is and must shift to include reflection on local communities of displacement, engaging the socio-cultural register of rights talk, and moving towards an immersive and co-productive task of knowing and unknowing rights and rightlessness. Such research is less about the reification of local acts and more about critical attention to the task of the practical, everyday negotiation of these various forms of power, action, and meaning that structure host and refugee rights talk and experience.